Welcome to episode 52 of the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. This episode features the radical historian, activist, and legendary author, Dr. Gerald Horne. In this episode, we focused on the book Mau Mau in Harlem, the U.S. and the Liberation of Kenya. Dr. Horne dove deeper into the history of Kenya, Marcus Garvey, Japan's influence, the labor movement, and the Bandung Conference. Thank you to Awareness for the music, and here's a brief jingle from a fellow Channel Zero Network member.
KiteLine is a weekly 30-minute radio program focusing on issues in the prison system. You'll hear news along with stories from prisoners and former prisoners as well as their loved ones. You'll learn what prison is, how it functions, and how it impacts all of us.
Behind the prison walls, a message is called a kite. Whispered words, a note passed hand to hand, a request submitted to the guards for medical care. Illicit or not, sending a kite means trusting that other people will bear it farther along until it reaches its destination. Here on KiteLine, we hope to share these words across the prison walls.
You can hear us on the Channel Zero Network and find out more at kitelineradio.noblogs.org.
To begin, I was wondering if you could describe the situation in Kenya in the 1930s when Ralph Bunche arrived. You write, Jim Crow was in Africa with toilets saying men European and Asian but none for Africans from Kenya.
Well, first of all, Ralph Bunche may be known to your audience as a former Howard University professor in the 1930s, man of the left then, who in the 1940s leapfrogs into the U.S. government bureaucracy and then to the United Nations, born in 1945, where he wins a Nobel Prize. Although, as I've indicated elsewhere, that was a very curious turn of events because what happened is that as Israel was being born, circa 1947, 48, 49, you see that the chief UN negotiator, Count Pope Bernadotte of Sweden, is assassinated by ultra-Zionist forces, and then Mr. Bunche takes his place. And I think it's fair to say that Mr. Bunche was more pliable and manipulable than his late predecessor. In any case, in the 1950s, Ralph Bunche came under fire from the U.S. authorities because of alleged purported communist connections during his left-wing period in the 1940s. And he was already sour on Washington. One of the reasons he said he wanted to leave the U.S. government bureaucracy for the United Nations was because of Jim Crow in Washington, D.C. Speaking of Jim Crow in Washington, D.C., when he arrived in Kenya, it was not unfamiliar to him in terms of the degradation of black people, in terms of the hovels in which they were forced to reside, in terms of this racialized hierarchy wherein you have European, mostly British, nationals living high on the hog, owning most of the land and certainly controlling the commanding heights of the economy. Although, as I point out in the book, Kenya represents another trait of the British Empire, which is that at some point, because of their desire to have a racialized hierarchy, they began to rely more on Euro-American nationals, and Euro-American nationals played a significant role in the Kenyan economy, just as I start the book by talking about Euro-American fighters who arrived subsequently in Kenya to help to prop up the tottering colonial regime in the 1950s. And it's also fair to say that there was a kind of relationship between people of African descent in North America and in East Africa, which began to blossom at the latter stages of the so-called Mau Mau revolt in the 1950s, which, of course, leads to Barack Obama Sr. Getting a scholarship to study at the University of Hawaii, and I'm sure your audience knows the rest of the story.
Yes, thanks for breaking that open and giving that foundation. And speaking about the collaboration between Kenyans and African Americans, and also Marcus Garvey, wanted to ask about the people were memorizing Garvey's articles in Kenya. And in 1925, there was an anti-colonial riot in Kenya inspired by Marcus Garvey.
Well, the Garvey organization, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, started by this Jamaican around the time of World War I, circa 1915, inspired in part by the example presented by Booker T. Washington. It's very interesting about Booker T. Washington. I also say in my Southern Africa book that Walter Sisulu, Sisulu, who was probably Nelson Mandela's closest comrade in the African National Congress, he too was inspired by Booker T. Washington. Now, I should say that I hold no grief for Booker T. Washington in the context of U.S. politics, where understandably and justifiably he's been juxtaposed against the example of W.E.B. Du Bois. And certainly Booker T. Washington in the U.S. context was willing to accommodate to Jim Crow. And, of course, he did help to build what is now Tuskegee University, which was an institution of higher learning that not only educated many Black Americans, but educated many Africans as well. And I think that therein you begin to see the attractiveness of Booker T. Washington, because at that particular moment, you saw a systematic effort by colonizing powers, be they in Jamaica or Southern Africa or Kenya, to deprive Africans of higher education. And these same Africans could come to Alabama, to Tuskegee, and receive higher education. And I think that many of them found that to be both attractive and inspiring. And I think that that helps to explain how and why it is that a Marcus Garvey could be attracted to come to the United States about 105 years ago or so in order to learn more about the example of Booker T. Washington. And as your comment suggested, and as the book suggests, the Marcus Garvey organization, the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association, enjoys astronomical growth, not only in the United States, and eventually having tens of thousands of members, developing a newspaper, the Negro World, which was sold throughout the Pan-African world, had strong branches not only in New York and Louisiana, but also in Cuba, Jamaica, of course, the eastern coast of the Central American Peninsula, the Central American region, particularly Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and, of course, in Southern Africa, South Africa, Namibia. Many of the newspapers were delivered by Black sailors. A forgotten aspect of historic political economy is that oftentimes sailors, at least in the Anglosphere, were of African descent. Many of them, of course, of South Asian descent. And so the Garvey organization had influence in Kenya, and I think that it was perceived justifiably in the African context and the Caribbean context as being anti-colonial, and therefore it was seen as providing a mortal threat and a mortal danger to colonialism, which was one of the reasons why there was an attempt to ban the newspaper, to jail those who were somehow connected with the Garvey organization. But ultimately, that proved to be unavailing.
Thank you. Thanks for breaking down that history. And I was wondering if you could kind of just talk about the influence that Japan had in the region on Kenya. And you had also spoke about how Mussolini had sought to stir discord in Kenya. And then you also kind of ties into your other work on Tokyo, how you said that the Tokyo forces also expressed reluctance to shoot at Askaris or East African forces.
Well, the influence of Japan on the Pan-African world before 1945 has been a particular interest of mine, reflected in a number of articles that you can find online, I would imagine, and certainly in books. The book I wrote, Race War, that comes out, as I recall, in 2003, and the book that I wrote a few years ago, Facing the Rising Sun. So basically the story is that circa 1853, the U.S. sails into Japan, and Japan is fearing that what had befallen Hong Kong in the previous decade, that is to say British colonialism circa 1841, 1842 was about to befall Japan. So Japan goes through a rapid transformation and is reflected in what's called the Meiji Restoration, M-E-I-J-I, Restoration, whereby there is a battle between feudal forces and proto-capitalist forces, with the latter prevailing. Interestingly enough, Hollywood tackled that subject in the movie The Last Samurai, which is very interesting, starring Tom Cruise. And for whatever reason, Hollywood sympathizes with the feudal forces, not the capitalist forces, even though they're capitalists. I think it's because these capitalist forces in Japan proved to be all too competitive. And I should also mention that I talk about Japan in my books on the South Seas and Hawaii. The book's The White Pacific, which deals specifically with how and why it is that even today in the Hawaiian archipelago, a disproportionate percentage of the U.S. nationals there are of Japanese origin. Because what happens, you have an independent Hawaii kingdom before the U.S. takeover in the 1890s. And like Japan in the 1850s, the Hawaii kingdom, as it surveys the landscape, it sees that it too could fall victim to a U.S. takeover, so it tries to work out a deal with Japan. But alas, it doesn't work. They're overthrown in any case. And then you have the rising Japan is resentful of the way Japanese nationals or Japanese Americans, in fact, are treated in Hawaii. I argue that that's a factor in the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December 7th, 1941. And I've noticed that some of my critics, they didn't like me saying that. I think that sometimes the historians and the critics, they prefer morality tales. And so you can't suggest that there might have been resentment in Japan towards racism directed at people of Japanese ancestry in Hawaii, because then that might provide a rationale for Japan attacking Pearl Harbor. You have to make it seem as if this was just evil personified. There was no reason for it, etc. I mean, I say in the book, Facing the Rising Sun, that I carried no grief for Japanese imperialism, but I feel compelled to explain to audiences why events happen, as opposed to just descending and devolving into simple-minded morality tales. In any case, another turning point comes with Japan's defeat of Russia, 1904-1905, a turning point in the struggle against white supremacy, as revealed in the words and analyses not only of W.E.B. Du Bois, but Ho Chi Minh, Sun Yat-sen of China, and Nehru of India. And at this point, Japan is rising, it's flexing its muscles. After World War I, at the negotiations at Versailles to effectuate a peace treaty, it wants written into international law of some sorts of prohibitions against racism, which does not go down very well in Australia, an officially racist nation, until maybe 1967, when under pressure from its U.S. paymaster, it's forced to make halting steps away from the more egregious aspects of white supremacy. And what this leads to is that Japan feels that it can attain leverage over its European and Euro-American antagonists by making an appeal to those who are subjugated within the British Empire and within the U.S. state. And of course, this leads to many Black nationalists in the 1930s, for example, devising the concept of the Asiatic black man. This is at a time when Africa was colonized, and so these Black Americans, they looked at themselves as walking in the footsteps of Japan, hence Asiatic black man. And then you see a similar appeal of Japan in Africa, not only in Kenya, but also in Southern Africa. I talk about the latter in my book, White Supremacy Confronted, on the liberation struggle in Southern Africa. And so this reaches a real fever pitch in the 1930s when Imperial Japan and Imperial Ethiopia basically brute the idea, B-R-U-I-T, brute the idea of a merger of the royal family, just like that was quite common in Europe, as you know, for the royal family of Greece to marry into the royal family of London, for example, or for the royal family in Germany to marry into the royal family of London, for example. It does not take off, but the fact that it was bruited obviously gives Japan an advantage in terms of its competition for hearts and minds in the Pan-African world, because, of course, you could be lynched in Dixie for reckless eyeballing, for looking at some woman of European descent innocently, but perceived as not so innocently. And here you had Japan and Ethiopia talking about a merger of royal families. And so this becomes a major factor after World War II begins. And I would argue as well that it's a major factor in loosening the bonds of colonialism, not only in Kenya, but I would say throughout Africa, because the U.S. basically dodges a bullet with regard to World War II, the Pacific War more specifically. My own estimation is, and this is obviously difficult to prove because what I'm about to say is counterfactual, but my own estimation is that but for the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 6th, August 9th, 1945, it would have been very difficult to defeat the Japanese and Indonesians. As a matter of fact, wherever you had European colonial empires, those were the places where Tokyo had dug deep roots. That is to say, Indonesia, India. Subhash Chandra Bose, B-O-S-E, an Indian national hero, of course, died fighting shoulder to shoulder with Japanese forces. It's in the places where Japan itself was the colonial occupier that Japan was not greeted, shall we say, as conquering heroes. And that would include China in the first instance and the Korean Peninsula in the second instance, not least because of the depredations inflicted by the Japanese colonial occupiers during that time. Now, Africa, of course, is a different story because there was no Japanese colonial occupation of Africa. And just as the United States looked to the now demonized Soviet Union to pull its chestnuts out of the fire between 1941 to 1945, and that's hardly controversial. The only people I know who criticized the U.S. alliance with Moscow during the time are the late President Herbert Hoover and the contemporary analyst Pat Buchanan. Otherwise, it's really not seen as that controversial. And so, likewise, the Africans, to get the European boot off their neck, they were looking at Tokyo. And the colonial occupiers recognized that. And I've argued that this is a factor in the agonizing retreat from the more horrible aspects of colonialism and of its cousin, U.S. Jim Crow, of post-1945.
Thank you so much for that history. And going back and building on the solidarity between African Americans and Kenyans, you had wrote about how African Americans had shared stories of the Haitian Revolution and marched alongside Kenyans against Britain. And then Britain later forbade any meetings between these two groups, and that African Americans and Kenyans marched together for Kenyans to get higher wages. I was wondering if you could talk more about that.
And this was in Kenya in the 1950s?
I believe so, or it may be, because I also had another note on 1942, said the battalion of the 812th Engineers came to Kenya and fired on police stations.
Right. Yeah. What's interesting, and there's been some writing about that, I think I've probably written about it too, which is that the Black American soldiers are viewed suspiciously and skeptically in Australia by the Canberra authorities, and certainly in Nairobi, because here you have these Black American soldiers, oftentimes they're carrying guns, oftentimes they're getting into scraps with Euro-Americans or Europeans, for example. This is seen as destabilizing to the colonial order. And many of the Black Americans are sympathetic to the Africans in Kenya. And this is not only with regard to the soldiers. As I've suggested a few moments ago, you also have black sailors sailing into Mombasa, the major Kenyan port, and they too are viewed suspiciously. What's interesting as well is that this also goes back to the slavery period in the United States, where South Carolina, one of the major slave states, tries to pass laws to keep black sailors in ships where the Union Jack flies, that is to say, under the British flag, try to keep them out of Charleston, for example, because for similar reasons similar to why the British were seeking to keep black American sailors out of Mombasa. It's a very interesting historical parallel. And from a narrow authoritarian point of view, their suspicions were justifiable because, as suggested, these black outsiders, if you like, did sympathize with the enslaved in South Carolina or with the colonized in Mombasa.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could break open more on the Council on African Affairs and the solidarity they showed with Kenya. And you had written about how Eslanda Robeson was in East Africa near World War II, and she was appalled at the treatment of Kenyans. And then I believe this Council on African Affairs was formed shortly after.
The Council on African Affairs was initiated by her spouse, Paul Robeson. He, of course, was the great socialist singer, actor, activist, athlete, the tallest tree in our forest. He spent a good deal of the 1920s and the 1930s in self-imposed exile in London, where he was exposed directly to the horrors of colonialism through his association with Jomo Kenyatta, who goes on to become a founding father of modern Kenya. The Council on African Affairs is initiated in circa 1937. It's driven out of business by the U.S. authorities circa 1956, which was part of a full-scale onslaught against various wings that were perceived to be too close to the U.S. Communist Party, and that would include not only the Council on African Affairs, but also the Civil Rights Congress, which was led by Robeson's good friend, William Patterson, and together they filed a petition at the United Nations, 1950-1951, charging the United States with genocide against black people in the United States. The CRC, Civil Rights Congress, was the subject of a book that I published some decades ago that's just come out in paperback a few months ago. In any case, Eslanda Robeson, the spouse of Paul Robeson, traveled throughout Africa. She wrote about her venture. It's a very enlightening book. And she also traveled to Southern Africa as well. And like Ralph Bunche, she too was horrified and outraged with how the Africans were maltreated and mistreated in that part of Africa. And Kenya becomes a solemn cause for the Council on African Affairs. Interestingly enough, although the Council focused on colonialism generally, they seem to have seem to devote special attention to the settler colonial regimes, be they Kenya or Rhodesia, South Africa. And that's understandable because the United States itself is a settler colonial regime. Although, interestingly enough, even though folks on the left could easily espy settler colonialism when looking overseas, they did not necessarily apply that same descriptor to North America for whatever reason. I guess the only explanations I can come up with are inadequate. Explanations being the propaganda for the 1776 war has been so powerful that it has overwhelmed any sort of analysis of this process whereby Europeans invaded North America and seized the land from the indigenous, and then dragooned Africans to come across the Atlantic to work for free. I'm going to have to think about that a bit further, because saying that the propaganda is powerful is insufficient. I mean, of course it's going to be powerful. Propaganda for any state is going to be powerful. So I'll have to think about that a bit more deeply.
Yeah, and it became such the propaganda was so powerful, it became like this mythology that's still growing out today, as you've written about.
It certainly is. That's for sure.
I was wondering if you could talk more about the role of the labor movement in Kenya. You had written about the 1947 massive organized strike hit Mombasa, and then Tom Mboya was a trade unionist, and then how this led into the 1952 state of emergency.
Yes. Well, the labor movement in the United States, its finest hour was in the 1930s, when you had the organizing of the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which, unlike its predecessor, the AFL, the CIO organized plant-wide, whereas the AFL would just say organize skilled workers. It would be as if you go into a university and you organize just the professors and don't organize the janitors and the cafeteria workers. And so it was the CIO that broke the mold and organized across the board, all workers at a particular work site. And they oftentimes were led by communist organizers, which then leads to a rift internally, leads to an attempt to put pressure on the CIO to ditch certain unions. And of course, these would be unions who would have reach into, say, Kenya, for example. I'm thinking of the National Maritime Union, which, as suggested, had sailors that sailed into Mombasa, Kenya on a regular basis, many of whom were black. In fact, the number 2 leader of the National Maritime Union, Ferdinand Smith, the subject of a biography I wrote some years ago, was of Jamaican origin and was deeply concerned about colonialism and racism and white supremacy. And so, unsurprisingly, you had an attempt by U.S. labor to assist Kenyan labor as part of a kind of workers' internationalism, the likes of which is not as prominent today as it should be. In any case, what happens is perhaps predictable. That is to say that Ferdinand Smith is deported from the United States circa 1950, 1951, as part of the anti-communist Red Scare. And his union, the National Maritime Union, is weakened as a direct result, to the point now where the union is a shadow of its former self, and U.S. vessels that are responsible for imports and exports to this very day. U.S. vessels are little more than floating slump with terrible exploitation of the sailor. In any case, what happens is that as the anti-communists become more prominent in the U.S. labor movement, they too begin to reach out to Kenyan labor, and therein lies the story of Tom Mboya, M-B-O-Y-A, who is of Luo ancestry, L-U-O, as is his compatriot, Barack Obama Sr. And Mboya has very close connection with these anti-communist forces in the U.S. labor movement. Recall that the AFL and CIO merged, more like a shotgun wedding, in the mid-1950s, where the CIO, weakened because of anti-communist purges, is swallowed by the AFL, and they develop a relationship, that is to say the AFL-CIO, with Tom Mboya, He visited the United States more than once, even after the state of emergency, circa 1952, and the onset of what's called the Mau Mau Revolt, M-A-U, and which we now know was a bloody reign of terror inflicted by the British. In fact, some of your audience may know the story of how it was only about a decade or so ago that records of the reign of terror were somehow uncovered in a warehouse in England, where they had been shipped surreptitiously, not stored in the National Archives of the UK in Kew Gardens, K-E-W, Kew Gardens, London, but gathering dust. And then that led to a lawsuit whereby some of the uglier stories of British depredation in Kenya came to light. Of course, the Africans who were the victims of these depredations, it came as no surprise, a secret to them, but it came as a surprise to many others, particularly outsiders. And so what's interesting is that you've had a basic flip of the script, whereby Mau Mau has come to be a phrase that symbolizes kind, at least in the minds of some, a kind of bloody terror, when actually it was the British who administered bloody terror, including summary executions, torture, all manner of gruesome tortures, by the way, in some ways exceeding the kinds of tortures masterminded by their bastard spawn, now headquartered in Washington. So this is quite a story. And it also points out, too, why history continues to face the need to be rewritten, because these records were only discovered about a decade ago. And so those, such as myself, I can't recall when my book came out in 2009. And
yes.
Yeah, so those records had not seen the light of day when I was doing my research or when I visited Kenya to do my research. And by the way, let me recommend to future researchers the Kenyan archives, which are in downtown Nairobi, right across the street from a hotel, which means you can just cross the street. All you have to do is cross the street from the hotel to get to the archive. It's very convenient.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. Yeah, and speaking of just the sheer violence, you wrote about Operation Anvil, and then you had mentioned the Magnani prison camp, which held 18,000 Mau Mau prisoners. Is one of the world's largest detention camps at the time.
Yeah, I mean, there's been an attempt by some, whose names will go unmentioned, sanitize and criticize the ugliness and the smelliness of British colonialism. We're oftentimes told that British colonialism was a net plus. People learned how to speak English as a result of British colonialism, etc. When actually it was really just organized violence. It was organized terror from the barrel of a gun. Certainly the power of the British Empire flowed from the barrel of a gun. And the story of how that evolved, I would point our audience to my book on the 16th century, where I suggest that internal wars in the British Isles, particularly English wars against the Irish and the Welsh and the Scots, helps London to develop the framework for what becomes a powerful military-industrial complex. And then those weapons and those tactics used internally are then exported abroad to the Americas, to Africa, to Asia. And having said that, it's no exaggeration to say that for various reasons, perhaps the worst excesses of the British Empire come in colonial Kenya. And I think it may have something to do with the fact that it was a settler regime, but it was a settler regime where the settlers were grossly outnumbered I don't recall the figures off the top of my head, but it's in the book. And I think that because the settlers felt challenged and felt that their regime rested on an unsteady foundation, which is true, it did rest on an unsteady foundation, that as a result, they had to go overboard in administering all manner of ghastly torture. And that is precisely what happened.
Thank you. So my next question had to do with the effect of the laws mandating separate schools in Little Rock, the effect that this had on Kenya. You had written about that. People were talking about this in Egypt and Uganda. And that coupled with the meeting of Africans and Asians in Bandung, Indonesia in 1955, which you write, quote, which made clear its unfiltered distaste for the kind of white supremacy that then obtained from Mombasa to Mississippi.
Yeah, but those are major landmarks on the road to independence for Kenya and independence for Africa. Just to step back for a second and to return to a previous thread, I think it's fair to say that the British Empire was terribly weakened as a result of the pulverizing blows it received both from Berlin and Tokyo. The British Empire tries to recover. That leads to the war in Malaya, now Malaysia, beginning in the late 1940s. That leads to the conflict over historic Palestine. But what you can see is that the British Empire is both weakened and is overstretched, fighting all around the world to maintain its empire. Mass demonstrations in Jamaica, for example. And so this energizes those who have historically been victimized by colonialism, which leads to this important meeting in Indonesia in the mid-1950s at Bandung. Interestingly enough, you had a number of Black Americans who traveled there, although not necessarily for positive purposes. That is to say, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell of Harlem, who was trying to get in the good graces of Washington, which was busily trying to either expel him from Congress or jail him. He traveled there on behalf of the United States. The novelist Richard Wright, you may know his novel Native Son, he wrote a book about his travel to Indonesia. I think it's called Color Curtain, if I'm not mistaken. You can look it up. And this was a meeting mostly of colonized countries and newly independent countries. Zhou Enlai of China was there. He was the number 2 leader in China. If I'm not mistaken, there was an attempt that barely failed to blow up his plane as he was traveling from China to Indonesia. You also had present there, if I'm not mistaken, a representative from Yugoslavia, which, of course, it has constituent elements, being Serbia, Croatia, Montenegro, Slovenia, etc., in southeastern Europe, but was pivotal in developing Bandung because of its role in trying to develop a so-called non-aligned movement, which would try to not be perceived to be in the camp of the socialist countries or capitalist countries. Although, of course, as matters evolve, many of the non-aligned countries wound up being perceived as being part of the socialist camp anyway, because the socialist countries supported them against the exploitation of the capitalist countries. So Bandung was a very important landmark, as noted. It gave a loud signal that imperialism and colonialism were to receive ever stiffer challenge. That was followed by the Suez Crisis of 1956, whereby Britain, France, and Israel sought to prevent Egypt from claiming the Suez Canal, which during the 1860s, when Egypt was subject to colonial occupation, not only by Ottoman Turkey, but by Britain and France as well. Suez Canal was built in, but Egypt had become independent subsequently. Gamal Abdel Nasser, the leader, wanted to claim the Suez Canal. Britain, France, Israel objected. They waged war against Egypt, but had to stand down because the Soviet Union, per my previous remarks about Bandung, refused to go along with this. And in fact, even the United States felt compelled to issue statements critical of this brigandage. And that was a turning point in world history because Britain drew the conclusion that the jig was up for the empire. It had to draw closer to Uncle Sam. France, the opposite conclusion, that it had to develop itself independently. Even today, you hear President Macron speak, underline speak, about strategic autonomy of France. And in any case, that was a signal to colonized countries that you did not necessarily have to bend the knee to the imperialist forces. Egypt showed that. And then the next year, in 1957, you had the segregation crisis in Little Rock, Arkansas, whereby President Eisenhower had to call in troops to protect black kids from being mauled and beaten by their Euro-American classmates as they seek to desegregate Central High School. In Little Rock, it's a black eye for the United States, which is trying to portray itself as the paragon of human rights virtue. Earlier that year, this is the fall of 1957, earlier that year you had Ghana independence. And so that chain reaction, Bandung, Suez, Little Rock, was setting the table for the imminent demise and the imminent retreat of British colonialism, not least in Kenya.
Oh, thank you for breaking open that era so well. My next question was, what really surprised you about the archiving in Kenya and Nairobi that you weren't expecting to find?
Well, one is what I wrote about, the movie. I can't recall. It was this movie that was made in Kenya, Hollywood movie, with Hollywood stars.
Someone with Grace Kelly.
Yeah, but what struck me was the detailed notes in the archives about the filming of that movie and how, and of course, the shameless exploitation, that's a given, of the Africans who were employed as extras in the movie, but also the opportunities that movie production presented for advance by the liberation force. Of course, Kenya, it's been a staple of Hollywood cinema. You might recall Out of Africa with Meryl Streep and Robert Redford. And of course, Kenya, too, it presents, it's very revealing in terms of, it exposes, I should say, how Hollywood views black people or how Hollywood views Africa. Because like many of these movies, Africa is just a backdrop. It's just scenery. So that the Euro-Americans construct their stuff, like Meryl Streep and Robert Redford. I mean, you see that all the time. It's become almost a bad joke about Hollywood movies. I mean, think of all the anti-apartheid drama. Now, of course, there would be reason to have Euro-American actors in anti-apartheid drama, because after all, we're talking about a nation, South Africa, that has about 5 million people of European descent and has exported to these shores Elon Musk, Roelof Botha. I'm sure your audience does not have to be acquainted with Elon Musk, but Roelof Botha, of course, is perhaps the leading venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. He, of course, is the direct descendant of apartheid last foreign minister, Pete Botha, P-I-K Botha, Botha, B-O-T-H-A. So you understand why with these anti-apartheid dramas, you have these Euro-American actors like Kevin Kline, for example, or Marlon Brando, for example. But still, South Africa. It is in Africa. About 80 to 85% of the people were black, but you would never guess that if you were to do a short survey of film about South Africa. And the same holds true for Kenya, too, as well. But with regard to the archives, once again, I recommend the archives. I think more work could be done on the role of the United States in Kenya. I think my book opens the subject, but more can be done.
Thank you. I think that movie you wrote about was called Mogambo.
Yeah, that's it.
So my last question was about the Kenyan and the influence in the Mau Mau on Black Power movements, such as the title suggests of Malcolm X. You've also written about the influence that it had on Medgar Evers and Charles Evers, Kwame Ture, H. Rap Brown, and Robert F. Williams.
Yeah, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Medgar Evers gave one or more of his children Kenyan names. The title of the book comes from Malcolm X finding inspiration in that liberation struggle. And I think the parallel is settler colonialism. That is to say that the Africans in East Africa were subject to settler colonialism, like the Africans and the indigenous in North America, subject to settler colonialism. Kenya was seen as an exemplar of how you weaken settler colonialism. And I think also, paradoxically, the fact that Mau Mau had such a fearsome reputation, even though, as I try to suggest, some of that's overblown, and what was really fearsome was the reign of terror by the colonizers. But in any case, that fearsomeness, I think, inspired many strugglers on this side of the Atlantic to deepen their own commitment to the struggle and to heighten their own militancy with regard to the struggle. And I think that's part of the lasting legacy of the liberation movement in Kenya. Now, of course, since that time, Kenya has become a kind of pillar of neocolonialism, but I think that that's due in no small measure to the changing global correlation of forces, whereby worldwide the forces of socialism in recent decades have been on the back foot, have been on the retreat, and as the French elections today, April 24, 2022, suggest, oftentimes leaving an electorate with a choice between neoliberalism and neo-fascism. Now, if that happens to an advanced capitalist country like France, one of the top 10 economies on planet Earth, well, one can only imagine what the choices will be for a relatively small country in East Africa, which suggests that perhaps we need a new stage of a liberation movement, this time directed at neocolonialism, with the same fire and fury that was directed previously at colonialism.
Well said. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for doing this interview, Dr. Horne. I really enjoyed the book and, as always, enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Time Talks podcast. I want to thank Dr. Horne for speaking to me once again. Please check out his books and support the research and work he does. Thank you to Awareness for the Music. If you are able, please support the podcast on Patreon and share it around.